and to share with you tonight a bit about Adrian. Welcome, everybody, to the 107th monthly gathering of Surrey Muse, an interdisciplinary art and literature presentation group. We gratefully acknowledge that we are on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Siamamu, Gatsi, Quiquetlem, Kwantlen, Kaket, Tawasan, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I'm your host, Mariam Zohra D., and tonight we feature author Shazia Hafiz Ramji, poet Ken Westdorp, and our open mic will begin with Christina Myers, followed by a reading from Celeste Snowber and Michael Oliver Stark, as well as music from Fake Can soundtrack accompanied with a video that is a work in progress by Noxpox. Thanks for joining us, and without further ado, let's listen to our featured presenters tonight. And to share with you tonight a bit about Adrian, Arleo, let's go to the website, adrianarleo.com/about. Adrian Arleo has spent the last 28 years living outside Missoula, Montana, with her family and a menagerie of animals. She works full-time as a ceramic sculptor and says the following about her work. For 40 years, my sculpture has combined human, animal, and natural imagery to create a kind of emotional and poetic power. Often there's a suggestion of a vital interconnection between the human and non-human realms. The imagery arises from associations, concerns, and obsessions that are at once intimate and universal. The work frequently references mythology and archetypes in addressing our vulnerability amid changing personal, environmental, and political realities. By focusing on older, more mysterious ways of seeing the world, edges of consciousness and deeper levels of awareness suggest themselves. Adrian studied art and anthropology at Pitzer College and received her MFA in ceramics from Rhode Island School of Design in 1986. She was an artist in residence at Oregon College of Art and Craft in 1986. At Silka Center for Art and Ecology in 1987, and in 2012 was an invited artist at the Jordan Schnitzer printmaking residency, also at Sitka Center for Art and Ecology. Adrian's work is exhibited nationally and internationally and is in numerous public and private collections. She received awards from the Virginia A. Groot Foundation in 1991 and 1992, and in 1995 was awarded a Montana Arts Council Individual Fellowship. Her work has been widely published in books, magazines, and on the internet. Adrian is a frequent workshop instructor across the U.S. and abroad and enjoys teaching courses on figurative ceramic sculpture. Thought-provoking work from Adrian Arleo, and a pleasure for us that her work is donned on the Surrey Muse posters. And now for our feature. Our featured author tonight is Shazia Hafiz Ramji, a poet, fiction writer, and editor who won the 2021 Poetry and Prose Prize hosted by Southern Alberta Art Gallery. She is a finalist for the 2021 National Magazine Awards, and her writing has been shortlisted for the 2020 Bridgeport Prize for International Creative Writing. And it has been nominated for the 2020 Pushcart Prizes. Shazia's first book of poems, Port of Being, received the Robert Krosh Award for Innovative Poetry, was named by the CBC as a Best Canadian Book of Poetry. And it was shortlisted in 2019 for several awards, including the City of Vancouver Book Award and the British Columbia and Yukon Book Prizes. Shazia grew up in Kenya, England, and the UAE, and moved with her family to Vancouver, BC at the age of 15. She now lives between Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto, where she is at work on a novel and a second book of poetry about faith, addiction, and her South Asian, Iranian, and Irish ancestry. As an editor, she is currently accepting submissions for Avaz, a chapbook anthology of poems by South Asian Canadian poets.
Hi everyone, I'm Shazia. I'm coming to you from the ancestral and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, and I'm very grateful and privileged to be living here and to be able to call this home. Thank you so much to Surrey Muse and Fawzia Rafiq for thinking of me. Fawzia, you thought of me a couple of years ago as well when I had just put out my first book, and you were so supportive and invited me a couple of times, and you've just done so much for emerging writers in general and for the writing community as well, and for so many years too, so thank you so much for that. Fawzia, on Twitter, you had mentioned that I would share some fiction, and even though I'm finished what might be the final draft of my novel, I feel like being a poet today, and so I think I'll share maybe a couple of poems instead. I want to share with you a couple of poems that were published in Event magazine recently, and that became finalists for the National Magazine Awards this year. It means so much to me that these poems were shortlisted because they are so important to me. They are part of a work in progress called Dear Kin, in which I address my ancestors. And they're the first poems in which I feel like I found a listener for my work, however constructed or artificial that might be within the context and the frame of the poem. I'm not sure I can explain what I mean any more right now in summary, but if you're interested in checking out what this might mean to find the listener in the work, or how a sense of address can really change writing and how we think about writing, I wrote a bit about it for a column on Open Book. Okay, so here are my two Dear Kin poems. And thank you once again to Event Magazine and the editors Joanne Arnott, Shashi Bhatt, who's actually got a fantastic new novel out. Please check out her work. And to editor Ian Cofield as well. Okay, so here's the first Dear Kin poem. Hi. Sorry, I'm going to start over. I always tend to dissociate when I read this one for some reason. Well, it's obvious what the reason is, but I will read it again. Dear Kin. Hi. I know you were there the night I almost died, after taking those drugs. The blue ones, like Mary Magdalene's robes, in a postcard from a pilgrim in the south of France. Blue like all the words for the quarry deep and sunbent, the sorrow of passengers over scripted water. But I'm not asking for the blue river. I'm not asking for water. I'm linen dry content. All I'm saying is that I know you were there the night I almost died. There's nothing to remember. I was in my body, but there were no sounds in me. If this sounds like madness to you, please excuse the weight of my eyelashes on your fruit. If this sounds like faith to you, please excuse nothing. The thing about belief is its face, its orifices of breath, pressed against the dark, gaping. Okay, and then I'll share there's one more Dear Kin poem, which is actually the first one in the series. Dear Kin, when I look for you, there is always water. There is always light and food and whiskey. I know this was not true, you having hauled me up from knives of hunger where the empire never set. When I call you, I call ships and alcohol. I call myself by the names that others have for me. This is wrong, I know, so I call you by your long names. The Persian ones, the Indian ones, from centuries ago, when you were from elsewhere, as I see it now. Those names, tart gooseberries, the weight of heartbeats on my tongue, tissue-thin skin beating light, beating rain on dry sand, dust rising, whispers of stars. But it feels wrong to think of you in the same breath as ships and stars. So then tell me what else I have. Tell me how else to think of you. Am I not giving you tired romance, currents of starlight? Wait for me, Kin. You know the kind of lonely I am. I go to the ocean even in winter. I say our secret names, like the prayer the seagull takes from carrion. I have to hold so much for mothers and the family that I can only think of you in adventures on uncrazy ships. My breath goes out when I see you suffering, you see. I have to try to remember my happiness when we're all together scraping burnt rice from hard silver, scraping our warm gums to unstick syllables. This is the only way to find you sometimes. Ships, sand, booze, burnt rice. My happiness is inevitable and misunderstood, only because you give it to me even in a different language, a conspiracy of shore. Thank you so much for listening and for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much, Shazia and Surrey Muse.
Let me introduce to you our featured poet tonight. Ken Westdorp is a Surrey poet who has published 2 collections of his poems, Gateway to Obscurity and Strength and Vulnerability. If the first was a cathartic journey through his life with a great deal of struggle, his second collection was inspired by his volunteer work with Night Shift Ministry and its care for the homeless and addicted community of Surrey Central, Whalley. While written primarily as a first-hand account of the many strengths and vulnerabilities people experience living on Surrey streets, Strength and Vulnerability also reflects the emotional upheaval brought on by COVID. Ken had begun writing as a child, but most of his published work has been done within the last 10 years, where his first published writings were poems that appeared in the We Are Newton anthology in 2016. Ken is the president of White Rock and a Surrey Writers Club, and he is now working on a biblical collection titled 72. Please welcome Ken Westdorp.
I want to recognize and be thankful to live in the unceded traditional territory of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, and Kwantlen First Nation. I'd like to thank the Surrey Muse for the honor and privilege of speaking on behalf of my poetry and having this venue to speak on. Although I hope to address you in person at the Surrey Public Library, because of COVID and restrictions on the pandemic, Zoom seems like an eventuality for the rest of all of us for at least a few more months, if not a year. So here it goes. I'm going to read from my books entitled Gateway to Obscurity, my first book, published in 2017, and my most recent book, Strength and Vulnerability. Now, a little bit of history behind Gateway to Obscurity. I like to write a lot of emotional poetry about life and how it affects us in our day-to-day life. And I write a lot of spur-of-the-moment poetry on scraps of paper. So one day my wife got sick of finding scraps of paper all over the house, and she said, make a book out of it. So that's how we came about with Gateway to Obscurity. So it can be purchased on Amazon Books, as well as Google Books and Indigo for $12.99. So if you're interested, after the broadcast, by all means, please purchase the book. So without further ado, I'd like to read my first poem from Gateway to Obscurity, which is entitled A Mother's Love. Now, a little bit of background on this poem. It was originally written as a Mother's Day gift, and since then I've revised it, and it's a recognition of the love and support I received from growing up from my mother. It's a poem especially dedicated to the bond mothers share with their children. So, the poem, A Mother's Love. I thank you so much for bringing me forth in life, nurturing me through gestation, ensuring my eventual birth. In childhood, I suckled your breasts, gaining strength and further development. Within your arms, I found love and comfort from loneliness. You taught me understanding and encouraged my dreams. When I was ill or injured, you aided in my recovery. During times of family squabbling, you sheltered me from the storm. Acting on my behalf, you helped keep the family intact. At times would I abuse your love, subjecting it to teenage rage. Terrible names I called you, torturing you in awful ways. How fortunate to have you as a mother, with all the troubles I put you through. I know I don't say it often enough, but you're my best friend in the world. The next poem I'd like to read to you is entitled Parental Expectations. And a little bit of background on this poem. Growing up as parents expect the best from their children. Failure is something seldom understood. Rather, it is an excuse for punishment. Getting 75% of the questions right? Well, why did you get 25% wrong? Being the only son, not only in my family, but in the entire family, meant I carried the name, that I was expected to have a son, that I should inherit my father's business, that I should be a success at everything I did, that I should marry and have children, that despite my creativity in writing and art, I should get a real job, be a mechanic, a carpenter, or a truck driver. The poem is entitled Parental Expectations, and it goes like this. Conflicts and a lack of consultation alienate each generation. Guilt and manipulation, upholding productivity, managing the family business. Artistic merit, belittled as frivolous and childish. Abandoned dreams inflict teenage regret. Necessary responsibilities overshadow another's pursuits. Unspoken regrets enforce a stringent agenda. Parental expectations ignite rifts between family members. Academic challenges to an imaginative mind. Rules and regulations over creativity. Talented behavior squandered beneath a father's ambitions. Hardship and anger drive a wedge between father and son. Time and reflection help to overcome several roadblocks. And the most cherished poem that I wrote is entitled Passing, and a little bit of background on that. Though my father had passed away several months before I wrote this poem, it is a difficult expression of loss. Many people wondered why I did not grieve as much as they did, nor that I did not take the leadership role as his son. I saw it from a different perspective, of a strong man who suddenly was no longer the physical force he once was, a man who was totally dependent on others. To me, his death was a release from the weakness he felt being powerless. It is a poem that haunted me in the wee hours of morning and insisted on being written that day, even though it was 3 a.m. That day, we scattered his ashes at a favorite fishing spot with just the immediate family. And these were the words that I felt best gave us both peace. Passing, and this is how it goes. Upon these fertile waters, you cast your ashes this day. A father, a son, a brother, a devoted husband. May you find peace and tranquility in life's final journey. Within nature's greatest symphony, each wave and ripple calms the pain. Though no longer among us, your memories will last. A child, a man, a mentor, and someone special. One day we will join you once more. Our family will then be complete. Till then, we say goodbye as your spirit is set free. And my latest book, entitled Strength and Vulnerability, also available at Google Books and Indigo and Amazon Books for $15.99. A little bit of background on it is it tells about my volunteer work with Night Shift Ministries, helping the street people living in Wally. So the book is entitled Strength and Vulnerability. And the first poem I'd like to read to you tonight is entitled Lighthouse, and it is dedicated to Mariam Connor, who founded Night Shift Ministries many years ago on the streets of Wally. And they serve the people living on the streets 365 days a year, whether it's sun, rain, snow, or storm. Not only do they serve food, but also offer compassion and love of Jesus Christ, and clothing, and also seek out shelter. So the poem is entitled Lighthouse, and this is how it goes. Night shift permeates darkness with everlasting hope. Love and dedication emphasized by compassion. Abandoned souls seeking direction find sanctuary. Young and old, men and women, struggling to survive against the hostility. Shunned victims garner love. Lighthouse. Faraway beacons guide wayward souls. Stopgap measures to a permanent solution. A fragile possibility surrounded by conflict. Dedicated helpers struggle to make a lasting difference. Essentials utilized effectively spark growing optimism. Flashes of encouragement substantiate a shift. And the next poem from Strength and Vulnerability is entitled Give Us Grace. And this poem is dedicated to Grace Edge, a person who overcame her own demons. So the poem is entitled Give Us Grace. Flickering sparks animate a depleted soul. Societal obligations neglected by the majority. Victimized innocence ravaged by abuse. Hostile behavior inflicts personal harm. Symbolic weaknesses corrupted by drugs. Inward reflection provides for tranquility. Nurturing angels bring about peace. Harmonious fulfillment deepens one's resolution. Overall commitment allows a conclusion. And the last poem I'd like to read from Strength and Vulnerability just happens to be entitled Strength and Vulnerability. As humans, we are composed of strengths and vulnerabilities. We allow ourselves to utilize these tools, others can be helped. Together, we can work towards a greater humanity by realizing we have both of these. Strength and vulnerability, a clash between humanity, swimming with insanity, searching for tranquility. A valiant hero, a hapless victim, striving to exist. Compassion and torture, a society that is fractured, preyed upon by vultures, embroiled in misadventure, entangled within complications, swarmed by false implications, a subject of exploitations and repeated denunciations, courage above adversity, sacrificing one's safety for the benefit of others, dramatic outspokenness against forces of hostility, and armies of ruthlessness, intervening on behalf of those less fortunate, building bridges between opposing forces, weakened by abuse, imprisoned by turmoil, there seems no escape. An angry soul crippled by aggression, a relentless addiction, inspired with devotion to make a contribution, overwhelmed by passion to alter archaic legislation, punishment and righteousness, a momentum of selflessness, defiant to ruthlessness, others may passively witness, a merciful Savior and a distraught sinner, seeking ultimately the validity. Thank you for allowing me to recite some of my poetry. And again, the books are called Strength and Vulnerability and Gateway to Obscurity. Thank you and good evening.
Hello, Mariam Zohra D here. I'm just going to, in light of having some extra time on our show tonight, I'm going to read something that I wrote back in the winter of 2004, quite a ways back. I've never really edited this, but I happen to be reading some of these old pieces I've recently found since we moved a few months ago. I'd say this piece is called Aola, and I'll just read you. I think I have time to just finish it. It's that short. Aola is the title. I was sitting on my backpack outside the sunny market, waiting for my buddy to come back with a bowl of ganja. My feet were damp and sore. We couldn't get a good spot to sleep last night. Our usual parking lot behind the market didn't give enough cover from the rain. That's when I first saw Aola, though, that morning outside the sunny market. It was her dark skin that drew my eye to her. It was as black as you'd ever seen the human skin could get. It glistened clear and clean in the dreariness of the cloudy, sunless day. I had to take a double look at her. I found her interesting right away, because she wasn't like the rest of the chicks you see chirping and squawking around here, who were so easy to peg down and predict. Stepping off the crowded bus, the doors swiftly swished closed behind her. Aola caught the ground floor of the sidewalk with her worn shoes that curved up from the toes, dodging an oncoming crew of skateboarders. Her dirty blonde streaks faded in and out of the thick wool hair that bounced over her forehead. Brown cords dragged at her feet. She glanced at me for a second and gave an honest, passing smile. I was warmed and wanted a hoot even more. Her eyes darted straight to the right at the red-hot blinking sign, XXX, and then the one after it, and the one after. Her dark black eyebrows lifted up and up. I giggled to myself. What kind of area have I come to? I heard her mumble to herself as she swirled right around to head the opposite direction. A tall, balding man with glasses walked by, and Aola went up to him. Sir, hey, hi. Do you know where 220 Granville Street is? Well, it should be right in between those two shops, I think. He pointed towards those storefronts she had just turned her back to. I knew the place. It was an office studio for graphic designers. Giving thanks to the man, she then put her hands to her hips and swayed back over to where the entrance was in between the two stores. Aha. That's the damned entrance, she said aloud and pulled on the door. About 20 minutes later, she came back out again, not looking as occupied in her own thoughts anymore. She was looking around, absorbing in every little detail. She seemed dazed and stood there in the middle of the sidewalk without a care. My buddy passed her and gave an up-and-down look and said, hello, flashing his yellow teeth. He was carrying German's djembe that was painted with a yellow and red lion. The fur was left on the goatskin. She couldn't get her eyes off it. Hey, you got a smoke on you? My buddy asked. Yeah, here. She handed him a couple of smokes. She looked over at me, and it was obvious we were together, with our ragged jeans and faded color that dresses us from head to toe. Red Stoney was my buddy's name. He had red hair and a dog we called Sphinx. She was trailing right behind him and went over to tug at Aola's right leg. You guys mind if I play on your drum? She asked with a most animated face. It was a surprise. Her features were like a crisp morning when the sun's just breaking out on a cold day and no one stepped out into the streets yet. She leapt in years from her expressions, younger than I thought, no, older than I thought. I couldn't tell what her hang-up could be. Everyone's got a hang-up, don't you? Anyway, Sphinx pulled her over to our spot, and I made room for her on my backpack. Sure. Red passed her the drum. Oh, my name's Aola. She looked at us, expecting introductions, I guess. I don't talk that much, and the both of us just sat there in comfortable silence. It was pleasant having her company for some reason. What's your dog's name? She tried again. Sphinx. She's a Roddy, 2 years old. Red rubbed his dog in the belly and played around with her for a bit. Aola lit a cigarette, threw some quarters in her hat on the ground, and began to play. She reminded me of German, the rhythms and pauses she took. The backpack was moving us both. She was tapping her foot and her eyes were closed. Her neck stretched up to the sky at the beginning of each sequence and then gradually lowered to rest her cheek on her left shoulder. I grabbed an empty bottle from the nearby street garbage can and joined Red's clapping, with my pen tapping out into the empty spaces between the charged but lulling clamor that was beginning to come together. She played like a mad woman, the soundtrack to an epic landscape shot, the slow beat that increases and heightens to a quickening and then resolves again. We went on for about 15 minutes, and then we looped out, and Aola skipped a beat. but then she stopped with a final break flam, and it was a good jam. The world seemed so quiet and still when we finished playing. Our hat had filled up with a bunch of change. Red took a toonie out and went across the street to the gathering place. He came back with a couple of cups of coffee and some donuts. It wasn't the last time we would see her, although I thought it would be. Actually, we began to see her more and more. She'd bring bud, fruits, and gifts, like a pouch made from felt and an embroidered dream catcher with glass beads and all. Red made a necklace for her, too, from the hemp him and me picked up in the valley. Well, one night we were at another spot on the same side of the street, outside the old theater building. It was night and the streets were packing up. I got my flute and guitar out of the pawn shop that morning. Red was working on a percussion ensemble of plastic buckets and bottles tied up together. Polly, the trombone-carrying hippie nerd, was in town and said he'd look out for us tonight. Aola, too, showed up. She sat down in one of her moods. She was wearing a long burgundy coat tonight, not her usual navy shawl. She smiled with her mesmerizing eyes and seemed quite relieved to be attended to when I invited her to pick up an instrument. She picked up the flute. Polly came by, and German was on his way from across the street. Soon, everyone was clapping a chaos that couldn't wait to become a synchronism. In the midst of my guitar strums, though, I caught her locking eyes with German. They were both doing drum solos together. Their drums were talking to one another. I started to feel the energy from my body drain. I couldn't hold up the guitar anymore. I went to the corner and took a smoke out. I pulled myself together and decided to enjoy the night for what it was. People were gathered and our hats were filled. I saw some cops walking towards us, though. Spoke too soon. And yes, they told us, as we already knew they would, to produce a permit to busk or leave. We packed up. We went to the nearest chill-out spot by the UBC entrance across from the art gallery. It's like a skating rink, a dancing floor. We did our second jam there. Aola danced and danced. She got so dizzy. She was swirling like a top all across the concrete ground. She came back and sat on the bench with me. Play the drum, Aola, I asked her, staring straight into her eyes. She received me with a long, still moment of eye contact. It was like a drink. She began humming and grabbed the drum. Oh, 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 all of my people, they tell me to go. All of my people, they tell me I don't understand. That's one thing for sure, one thing for sure. She sang out of nowhere. It astounded me. But just as I was getting over the impact of her voice, she clumsily halted. I don't like this line. Oh, my broken heart. It's so negative. But I don't want to change the way it fits into the song. She sang it out for me. Oh, my broken heart. I thought about it for a bit, trying to get my eyes off her. How about, oh, my open heart? I said, and she sang it right away and brought the drumming in at a perfect time. The way she interlaced lyrics between the oration of the djembe impressed me. I started to feel down again. An hour later, we all dispersed. And Aola and German walked closely together took a turn, parting from the bigger group. I felt a sting. I didn't see either of them for a while, until Saturday the next week. They looked like they were coming right out of the bush. And indeed, they had been camping at Stanley Park, but the cops had left a note on their poorly camouflaged pile of sleeping bag, tent and tarp. "We know you're here, so leave before we find you." They were ear to ear with smiles, though. Aola had brought me a Swiss Army knife, handy for cutting the apples and mangoes that came with her, too. As an aside, I'm sure her favorite thing in the world is fruit. I'm certain. Anyway, I was really not that happy to see her. I didn't want to see her. I wanted it to remain a possibility, that I could be with her someday. The way German and Aola were with one another, it seemed that they were going for the long haul. They'd come to say goodbye, really. They were going to hitchhike to Ontario. Aola was going to go for singing and music at some university there. I took a last look at her and felt like I wanted to get cleaned up and stop dealing. But I like my life on the street. I don't like the pressure of society. I like playing music, live in the midst of life happening. It itself is a high. Next couple of weeks, I got some deals done, and in another couple of weeks, I was going to get some money rolling in. When it came, I fucking escaped to the beach with a bunch of bullshit and partied alone. Alone. I don't know how long I hung out. I remember as the sun was setting, or maybe it was rising, Red Stoney was with me. I drew him some diagram. All I can recall is that it was a triangle, like a prism. I got fucked for a week. All I can say is that when I left the beach, I lost a lot of weight. I looked so different in the mirror at the McDonald's washroom. Kids on the street thought I'd gone mad. I got a foreshadowing thought. at that moment when I sat at my so-frequented spot outside the Sunny Market. I remembered I wanted to stop dealing. I wanted to start feeding myself. It was like the recovery of an interrupted train of thought. A couple of days later, I got a motel room at the Regal, and I started to recuperate. Red Stoney scored a CD player and left it at my place. He'd come by and see me through the day, but he'd bail in the evening. I'd sneak out in the mornings, but still, I'd roll back in and stay in the whole day through. Months rolled by this way. One morning at the Blends, I found German sitting, smoking. Ewok, German nodded. We never talked much in the 2 years I'd seen him around, but none of us were liars. I could always look him in the eye. "Coffee, my brother." He handed me the change. He said Aola got pregnant, and German and her got in a fight. He was back and forth from her home to the streets over the 9 months. I helped him get over the anger and frustration, and while he hung out with me, he let me get through each day. For every day I craved, I relapsed almost every month. German was a big meal eater too. He'd make hamburger helper once a week. I was getting some meat on my body. One day, I found he left his jacket on the chair. A book from the pocket hung out. I slid it out. It read, Siddhartha. I opened up the cover and began reading. I read it without thinking. It kept my mind off of things. I began to feel like I could master my mind. I was putting it down to grab a drink and saw that there was some writing on the inside of the back cover. It was a poem. It was by Aola. I read that poem over and over again. Titled The Longest Night, it said, Hey, I dealt you a hand of wishes, but the staff for the ridge found you no wood, and the water under the bridge offended you to boot, and the whole thing fell through. I dealt a hand at the bank of the sinking beach, a hand that stuck, trembling between the breaks, pressing against our feet. Alongside privilege, blind hope finds abundance. A deep self-betrayal seats itself and faces you in the audience. My eyes on you. Deal the hand that holds me now, the bridge that held us then. Your distance is a moon that lit up the longest night, and I won't deal, and I won't gamble, I won't pretend to know your plight. I read it without thinking. Like I said, I read that poem over and over again. German saw it sitting on my side table, and without being asked, he said, You can have that if you want. It was really strange when we met Aola by the bus stop a few weeks later. She was walking with a little girl that was undoubtedly German's daughter. She saw us and crossed the street. She gave German her phone number, and while he played with his baby, she came over and stared right at me, awkwardly close. I feel like I know you, but your name's not coming to my mind. She looked at me questioningly. Ewok? She beamed. That was one of my favorite moments with her. I was happy to make her happy. I looked much different than the last time she saw me. She looked beautiful, different too, with more fat on her cheeks, curvier hips, and more wisdom across the face than ever before. 2 years went by. I began to do studio work with the guitar and flute, getting paid for fills, even doing some recordings of my own. Last New Year's, I lost it, relapsed again. The gig with the studio collapsed. The two running the project, they broke up. I had a cute girl, great, kind being that New Year's too, but that was the end of that. Nevertheless, the poison's leaving my body. It's still leaving my body. I met Aola 2 days ago, walking across the lights at East Georgia. She was walking towards me. We met halfway and slowed down. I pressed my hands together and bent my face down. She copied me. We turned around counterclockwise. Ewok, she said, and the world seemed to go in slow motion. Aola, I said, and we twirled our faces from facing each other to facing the direction we were going. With her on the other side, and me on my way to the other side. And now to introduce to you our open mic opener, Christina Myers. Christina Myers is an author, editor, and journalist who has published 2 titles. Her nonfiction anthology, Big, Stories About Life in Plus-Sized Bodies, won the 2021 Ippy Silver Medal Book Award. And her debut novel, The List of Last Chances, made the BC bestseller list in the first week of its publication. Christina's writings have been published in various anthologies, newspapers, and magazines. She is a member of the Writers' Union of Canada, Canadian Authors Association, and the Federation of BC Writers. A graduate of the Writers' Studio at SFU Vancouver, Christina is now working on her next 2 books as she juggles her creative work and stay-at-home parenthood from her place in Surrey. Please welcome Christina Myers.
Hi there, I'm Christina Myers, and I'd like to start by saying thank you to Surrey Muse, to the organizers, and also my fellow writers and artists who are here tonight, continuing to organize events like this over the last 18 months has been difficult work, and I know a lot goes into this behind the scenes, so thank you so much for the work that everybody has done to make this happen and to continue to create opportunities for writers and artists to create and to connect with each other. I'm really grateful to be part of that tonight. Before I start, I also just would like to acknowledge that, like Surrey Muse, I am myself here in Surrey, and that is the unceded traditional territory of the Katzie, Semiahmoo, Kwantlen, and other Coast Salish people. By way of quick introduction of myself, I'm a writer and an editor and a former journalist. I have 2 books out right now. I'm not going to read from either of them tonight, but I thought I would quickly mention them in case anybody was interested and wanted to follow up and go find those later. This book was out in March 2020, so sort of right as our big changes were coming into effect in the world, this book was being born. It's called Big, Stories About Life in Plus-Sized Bodies. It is an anthology of nonfiction. I was the editor and creator of this book, and I do have some of my own writing in it as well, but it's also 26 writers in total. And we just won a silver medal from the Ippy Awards for that, which recognizes books from around the world. And so we won the silver in the anthology category. We were very grateful for that. Published by Caitlin Press and available wherever you buy your books, hopefully at your local independent bookstore. My second book, more recent book, just came out in the spring. My first novel, The List of Last Chances, also published by Caitlin Press. So thank you to Caitlin Press, and grateful to BC publishers who so often work with BC writers. And that book also available wherever you might be buying your books. As I said, I didn't think I would read from either of those tonight. I thought I would do something different. With the wildfires in the last many weeks here in BC, I've been thinking about our world a lot, the environment a lot, and I thought I would read something that I wrote last year that speaks more to that issue. This is an essay that was published last year by Asparagus magazine. I'm not going to read it in whole. It would be too long for tonight, but if you want to read the rest of it or any of the other amazing work from essays to journalism that Asparagus Magazine does, you can find them online at asparagusmagazine.com. They focus on issues of sustainability and the environment, and they are a Canadian magazine. So this piece was published by them last year. And as I said, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to read some snippets from throughout that piece. So this is called Gardening for the Climate Apocalypse. There's a small window on the west coast between summer's brief heat and the rain that dominates the rest of the year, which leaves only small pockets of time in early autumn to strip the garden for winter. A few weeks ago, our garden boxes overflowed with tangled vines, tidy rows of leeks and carrots, and mounds of mint and parsley. But now all that remain are a few late beets, a pair of heavy-headed sunflowers, and a trio of fat pumpkins waiting for Halloween. It's messy work, chopping back vines and pulling plants out by the roots while making sure to leave the perennials untouched. I can feel winter in the soil now, a chill that makes my hands ache if I forget my garden gloves. The ground is already muddy, and the morning dew burns off later and later each day, cousin to the coming frost. By day's end, I'll have dirt in my hair, on my knees, and under my fingernails. But this labor is pleasurable in its way, satisfying, quiet, purposeful. The autumn sun is warm on my back, and my body always feels strongest when doing hard but useful work. The cycle of seasons never feels more obvious than when the garden is put to bed, a reminder that the end is, in fact, also the beginning. The spring before last, I'd watched my children hunker down next to their dad, heads bowing over the newly turned dirt, hands full of corn seed. I couldn't hear what he said, but I knew he was telling them how to make things grow. Dig a hole about this deep, drop the seeds in, there you go, push the dirt, pat it down. No, gently, gently like this. They nodded, solemn and attentive. Crouched down with messy hair and dirt on their faces, they looked almost as they did as toddlers, thrilled by everything. We'd rototilled the ground on that side of the house earlier in the day. The lawn had been badly damaged from drainage repairs to our 80-year-old house, reducing a once lush carpet of green to a bumpy patchwork of moss, weeds, and a few resilient tufts of grass. I'd balked when my husband first suggested we turn it into a corn patch instead of reseeding with grass or maybe clover. Corn, I repeated, incredulous. Corn in the middle of the yard, right next to the road where neighbors walk by in the evening, where the kids play. I'd put my foot down. Definitely not. But he continued arguing for it throughout the day with an endless list of points in its favor. I countered with vague objections, most of which boiled down to the fact it wouldn't look like everyone else's yard. He pointed out that I always rail about the uselessness of suburban lawns and the water they waste, the nonsense of the entire concept. Still, I resisted. At an impasse, he pulled the ace out of his back pocket. I'll be teaching the kids how to grow stuff. That's important. They should know for the future. For the future. I nodded, turned away, swallowed and shrugged. All right, I said, we can have a corn patch. We got lucky a few years ago with a used glass and aluminum frame greenhouse my sister no longer wanted in her own yard. My husband built a base for it in one corner of the garden and filled it with pots. In the artificial climate, green peppers, cucumbers, and tomatoes overflowed, riotous and magical. The kids slid the door open and laughed at the gust of tropical air that escaped, marveled at the plants, and helped their dad pick the harvests as they ripened. Together with the beets, carrots, and onions in the rest of the garden, we could barely keep up with all of it, and sent every visitor home with bags of vegetables. I know they're too young to have memorized the specifics just yet, which vegetables need more or less water, sun or shade, and when to plant and harvest. But they've already absorbed the fundamental lesson that time and patience and seeds and water and sun and dirty hands will equal food eventually. Knowing this equation might just save them someday, and watching them learn it saves me a little bit each day. I wake up in the middle of the night and check my children are still breathing, then lie in my own bed thinking about the systems we've created to keep us fed and warm with electricity and clean water and other luxuries that we've long since forgotten are luxuries at all. It feels so fragile now, a precarious structure that could tumble down at any moment, tomorrow morning or next year, or a decade from now. I worry for my children, for my siblings, for my friends, for the people I love who are too far away for me to protect. I worry about how to change course, and that it's too late for any course change to make a difference. I worry I can't predict if the shifts ahead of us will arrive slowly, bearing down a little at a time, or come all of a sudden, a crash from which we will not recover. But I don't worry so much about the earth, though my heart breaks with each additional wound we inflict. The earth will go on with or without us. She does not need us as we need her. When we destroy her to the point we can't live here anymore, she'll spend the next million years evolving in new ways, with different kinds of life. She might someday be covered entirely in fungus, bacteria, and moss. She might be all ocean, a water world teeming with sea creatures looking like long-lost cousins of those today. She might be a desert with lizards hiding in cool, dark dens, cactuses blooming once every 100 years when the rain comes for a handful of minutes. If we are not here, we teeming masses of humanity who consume and consume and consume without thought for the future or even for each other, the earth certainly will not care. In fact, she will likely breathe a great sigh of relief in our absence. So that's as far as I will read on that. As I said, it's at asparagusmagazine.com. And to finish, I just, again, would like to say thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone who is watching. The community that we've been able to create in readings like this and events like this and online spaces has been quite life-saving over the last year and a half. And just so grateful for everybody involved. So thank you so much. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the readings tonight. Bye.
Hello, I am Celeste Snowber, and I'm here talking about my new book, The Marrow of Longing. And I'm really excited to be here in my favorite bookstore in Newfoundland in Torres Cove, called Running the Goat Books and Broadsides, which is an incredible little bookstore in Atlantic Canada. And I'm very thankful to be here reading. So The Marrow of Longing is a collection of poems that explores the themes of longing and belonging, identity and place, connected to the land, and particularly my Armenian culture. My mother was an Armenian genocide survivor, and so it looks at trauma, intergenerational healing, trauma, and the beauty of a culture that is rooted in food and eggplant and peppers and everything stuffed. So I'm going to read you a couple of poems, and I'm going to start with Recipes in the Body. She cooked through her body, an intuitive scent in the fingers, a little of this, a dash of that. They knew just the right amount. There was no cookbook in the old country. Food was a dialect they spoke. To cook for those you love, the recipe is passed down from tongue to tongue, heart to tongue. I long for aromas, flavors of my childhood. Every Christmas I make cheese bread. I am closer to the taste I remember. Cheese melts in the mouth with parsley. I still don't like it. I still don't make it like my mother. I revisit my childhood, eat at my friend Ari's family home. His Armenian mother and grandmother release taste and textures of my youth. Pine nuts and lamb, green beans and tomato, caressed in olive oil, doma stuffed with filling. I cannot stop thinking of explosions on my palate. I dream of every food in my household growing up that was stuffed, meatballs, peppers, tomatoes, grape leaves. I lament that my children haven't eaten anything stuffed except a bird. Recipes hidden in the body, stored in memory and marrow, wait to be taken into the stew of my life. The story of one. If we only have fragments, aren't all pieces a whole? What happens to one happens to all. So much has gone missing. Strands of DNA whisper a mystery. The story of one is the survival of a nation. I grew up on the Atlantic coast, and you do not grow olive trees on the Atlantic coasts. But my mother decided to grow an olive tree. This is called olive wisdom. The neighbors told her, olive trees can't grow here, not in the yard where we made home in a little island town named Nahant on the Atlantic coast outside Boston. They thrive on Mediterranean climates, rocky soils, well-drained, long hot summers, spring delivers leaves scattered like stars. We lived in the cold of New England, my mother the resilient weather, unpredictable and persistent as northeasters, pushing and rattling our windows. Our olive tree grew and grew, years after my mother died, a good decade, until the new owners cut it down in lieu of a lawn. My mother and the olive tree are gone. They both keep reminding me to dare to dream the impossible. Grow that olive tree, the papaya, that hair, that idea, that book, that life, that patio garden. Say yes to olive wisdom. Diaspora dreams. I was never taught the vowels, syllables of her native tongue. My mother held the shame of being an immigrant. 62 years later, I grieve what resonates and vibrates inside. I cannot ask how to make the cheese bureg, the stories her mother knew, how words roll in her mouth, how her dialect tastes. Once, dear Uncle Carney taught me the alphabet. As we sat at the kitchen table, as she stuffed grape leaves, the letters just marks, veins on the page, I still long for the sounds of her ancient terrain. Ripe with my history, longing for the alphabet spoken against my skin. And I also want to mention that the artwork in this book is by Marcia Noritsa Orabashian, an amazing artist, and they are scattered through the book. And I just want to thank you for this time. And you can get this from Harp People's Press, Harp Publishing in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Michael Stark, and it's the second time I've read at the open mic at Surrey Muse, and I'm very excited to do so. It's an incredibly wonderful event, and I thank the organizers for hosting it, and I hope that there's many more years to come of the Surrey Muse event. Somebody asked me the other day why I wrote the poem that I'm going to read to you today, and I'm not quite sure, or maybe it's too personal, I'm not sure, but I do want to share it, and I hope you enjoy it. The poem is called The Ruse. It's a work in progress, and here we go. Cold is the morning breeze, warmed by an insatiable desire, residing together between the trees. Unaware to what may come, a moonless night appears. Hand extended, the heart turns numb. The embers of anticipation fade, casting of long shadows enter the soul. The fabric of life begins to fray. Mercilessly, time rushes, refusing the sun its dues. Silence is all that can be heard. Darkness is the light completing the ruse. Dancing in the moment, has it been sold? The warmth of the touch is no longer. The tale has now been told. Sullen, the blue sky, a mere memory. A single cloud has turned to ash. All that's left is life's treachery. Overcoming all odds is the rise, blazing the horizon with a fiery might, all unfolds before the eyes. Cast out by the spirit with a flowing cloak, the shadows leave hungry, the spell has been broke. With intent time has paused, lilies reach to above, caressing the winds, devouring the cause. The tale has been told, but not with truth. Much more to the story of darkness and its ruse. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great evening.